The sea that night was unnervingly calm. A light wind, clear visibility, the surface of the water smooth as if it had never known a storm. Three fishing trawlers moved quietly through familiar waters, each crew doing exactly what they had done countless times before. There were no warning signals, no emergency calls. No reason to stop, or to suspect that anything was wrong. But somewhere beneath that dark, silent surface, something else was moving. No lights, no sound the human ear could hear. Only faint signals overlapping one another, and a distance that was being misjudged. If there was no storm, no major technical failure, no reckless decision, then what caused 4 men to vanish in just a few minutes? In the middle of a night when everything appeared completely normal. 23 o'clock. Firth of Clyde, off the coast of Scotland. At approximately 23 o'clock, 3 fishing trawlers were operating within the same area of the Firth of Clyde. This section of water contained a deep trench commonly used for bottom trawling. The vessels maintained visual contact with one another and monitored their surroundings by radar. No unfamiliar ships appeared in the area. There were no abnormal changes in maritime conditions. The Antares was towing her nets on a steady heading. The other 2 trawlers, Heroine and Hercules, were working parallel tracks nearby. Their crews had operated in this area many times before. They were familiar with the currents, the depth, and the routine rhythm of night fishing in these waters. What they saw, both visually and on radar, matched their experience exactly. At this point, every assumption pointed towards safety. With good visibility, no radar contacts, and other vessels continuing to fish normally, there was no practical reason to alter course or procedure. The decisions being made were decisions of continuation. Maintain heading, maintain speed, continue the shift. There was no reckless behavior, no unusual maneuver. No signal that required the crews to stop and reassess the situation. Every system the fishing vessels relied upon human experience and civilian equipment alike was delivering the same conclusion. This was a safe area to keep working. What did not exist within those assumptions was the possibility of a presence beyond their field of observation. Not because it was hidden, but because it did not belong to the system they were using to understand their surroundings. At 23 o'clock, no one on the surface knew that this sequence of reasonable decisions had already begun to narrow every remaining option. If every instrument tells the same story, where can danger still come from? Before midnight, beneath the waters of the Firth of Clyde. At the same time, several dozen meters below the surface, a nuclear-powered submarine was moving through a designated training area. HMS Trenchant, a Trafalgar-class submarine, was operating with a full crew and a group of officers undergoing the Perisher Command course. This was not a combat patrol. It was a live training exercise, conducted with a real vessel, real systems, and decisions that could not be repeated. The Perisher course is designed to eliminate candidates who are not capable of commanding a submarine. The pressure is constant. The evaluation is continuous. At this stage of the course, trainees are given direct control of the submarine under supervision. Every action must follow procedure. Every deviation is recorded. There is no room for instinctive judgment. The assumptions inside the control room were clearly defined. Passive sonar was active. Exercise parameters were set. The operating area had been designated in advance. The threats that mattered were simulated warships and tactical scenarios, not civilian fishing vessels. Within that framework, the situation remained under control. Decisions were made exactly as the training required. Maintain depth, hold low speed, execute evasion and approach drills against a simulated target. No maneuver exceeded limits. No order contradicted established doctrine or the accumulated experience of the crew, but the system carried an unspoken limitation. It was built to train for war, where targets are expected to behave like targets. It was not optimized to distinguish ambiguous overlaps between multiple civilian sound sources, especially in an environment saturated with constant acoustic noise from fishing activity. At that moment, no one in the control room treated the presence of fishing vessels as a critical variable. Not because of carelessness, but because within the system's operating logic they were not considered a priority threat. Training was proceeding exactly as planned. And that was precisely why no one had reason to stop. Was a system designed for war ever truly safe when operating in peacetime? After 23 o'clock, Antares towing nets in the deep trench. After 23 o'clock, Antares was towing her nets along a familiar track within the deep trench. The vessel had been at sea for several hours. Fishing operations were continuous, with no significant interruptions. Work on deck followed the established rhythm of night fishing that the crew had repeated many times before. There were 4 men on board Antares, each assigned a clearly defined role. The skipper remained in the wheelhouse, monitoring the vessel's heading and the surrounding traffic. 2 other fishing trawlers, Heroine and Hercules, were operating in the same area. The distance between the vessels was close enough to maintain situational awareness, but not close enough to require coordination. For a short period, Antares and Heroine were moving on intersecting tracks. This was not unusual in bottom trawling. When vessels share the same trench, course adjustments are often required to avoid fouling gear and to remain within the optimal towing line. These adjustments were routine and rarely hazardous. The skipper of Antares contacted Heroine by radio. The exchange was brief and informational. He stated that he would be going below to rest for a short period, temporarily handing control to another crew member. This was not an emergency measure, nor an unusual decision. During extended night operations, rotating rest is standard practice to maintain alertness. After the call, Antares continued towing. Control had been transferred. Heading was maintained. Speed remained unchanged. On the surface, there were no indications that would have required the operation to pause or the situation to be reassessed. Approximately 10 minutes later, from Heroine's position, Antares was observed altering course, turning to starboard to resume her northwest towing line. This was a standard maneuver intended to keep the nets within the trench and to avoid conflict with other vessels. Nothing about the maneuver suggested difficulty. At that moment, Antares entered a state in which rapid intervention became increasingly difficult. The nets were under tension beneath the water. Command had been redistributed. The skipper was no longer continuously present at the controls. Every decision remained reasonable within the operating context of a civilian fishing vessel, but each one also narrowed the margin for responding to factors outside that context. No clear error had yet occurred on board Antares, only a sequence of reasonable decisions continuing to carry the vessel forward. If Antares did nothing wrong in these moments, where did the first deviation truly begin? After midnight, two timelines begin to overlap. After midnight, Antares was still towing her nets within the deep trench. The gear was set at a fixed depth, under tension beneath the surface, following a predetermined line. Bottom trawling required the vessel to maintain a steady course and consistent speed. Once the nets were deployed, the fishing vessel's ability to maneuver was significantly reduced. Sudden course changes or an abrupt stop were no longer simple options. At the same time, approximately 60 meters below the surface, the submarine trenchant was moving through the designated training area. This depth was considered appropriate for the planned exercises. The submarine remained submerged. No identification signals were broadcast. There was no requirement to communicate with civilian vessels operating above during a closed training exercise. The two systems were now operating within the same physical space, but according to entirely different logics. On the surface, Antares relied on visual observation, civilian radar, and established fishing routines. Below the surface, Trenchant relied on passive sonar, exercise parameters, and military target classification. There was no direct channel of communication between them. No automatic warning system connected one world to the other. Decisions on both sides continued to be made within their own frameworks. Antares held her towing line to prevent fouling the nets and to avoid interference with other fishing vessels. Trenchant maintained depth and course as required by the exercise. Neither side had a reason to alter its behavior. During this period, the physical distance between the two vessels was steadily decreasing, yet neither side fully perceived it. From Antares, no indication appeared on radar. From Trenchant, sonar signals began to overlap within an environment saturated by continuous acoustic noise, but not clearly enough to be classified as abnormal. At this stage, the risk no longer resided in a single decision, but in the simultaneity of many reasonable ones. Each system continued to function smoothly within its own limits, while the gap between those systems quietly widened. Two worlds were now overlapping, without recognizing one another. At this moment, no one had enough information to stop, and no one had been assigned the responsibility to ask the question. When two systems coexist without being designed to understand each other, who is responsible for the space in between? Shortly after midnight, inside Trenchant's sonar room, at a depth of approximately 60 meters, the submarine's passive sonar began registering multiple contacts at the same time. Signals appeared on the display, classified by intensity and acoustic characteristics. In an area with active fishing, this was not unusual. The acoustic environment was already complex. Among those contacts, one signal began to stand out. Its sound grew stronger, steady, persistent. According to the system's interpretation, it was treated as a single target. In reality, it was the overlap of two separate sound sources, the propeller of a fishing vessel and the steel cables of trawl gear being dragged under tension. Passive sonar does not provide precise range. It measures intensity. When the signal reached approximately 35 decibels, it indicated that the source was very close. But close, in sonar terms, does not mean a fixed position. Distance still had to be inferred. Assumptions were applied immediately. In a training context, a stable contact is typically interpreted as a single vessel. There was no clear indicator that two separate objects were occupying the same acoustic space. The system did not flag an error. Procedure did not require a pause for deeper verification at this stage. A decision was made based on what was visible on the display. An order was given to alter course in order to increase separation. It was a correct response according to doctrine, consistent with training logic. But the timing of that decision had already been delayed by the ambiguity of the data. As the submarine's bow began to turn, sonar registered the signal changing faster than expected. The intensity did not drop. The bearing did not open. Actual distance was continuing to close, but the system could not express that clearly. At this point, control was no longer entirely in human hands. Actions were still being taken, but every option was constrained by incomplete information. No new data appeared that would justify reversing the decision. No warning was strong enough to force a full stop. 35 decibels. Too close to correct. If the system shows only half the truth, who is responsible for the other half? 2:19. The point of no return. At that moment, Antares' trawl gear was under full tension. The nets were set deep in the trench. The vessel was no longer free to maneuver. Every movement of Antares was constrained by the force pulling from behind. Below the surface, the submarine's motion introduced a sudden external force into the trawl system. There was no prior warning. No surface alert. In an instant, the entire load transferred into the steel cables. The nets were violently pulled taut. Antares was dragged backward. The hull rolled to starboard. On deck, stability was lost almost immediately. There was no time to assess, no time to follow procedure. Water began flooding into the wheelhouse through open points. The vessel lost stability rapidly. Under these conditions, transmitting a distress call was no longer a viable action. No mayday was sent. No external communication was made. All remaining actions were reflexive. Engines were engaged. Attempts were made to reduce tension. Efforts to break free from the snag followed. But once the nets were being pulled by a mass far greater than the vessel itself, those actions could not change the outcome. Antares rolled fully to starboard and began to sink. Time was measured in seconds. There was no opportunity to correct, no second cycle, no call for help. After 2:19, beneath the surface. After the impact, the submarine slowed. Power was reduced. On sonar, the abnormal signals gradually faded. What remained fit a familiar scenario. The submarine had fouled fishing gear. Inside the control room, that interpretation was not disputed. Submarines becoming entangled in fishing nets was not unheard of in waters with heavy trawling activity. There was no collision alarm. no indication that a surface vessel was in distress. The submarine rose to periscope depth to survey the surrounding area. On the surface, 2 fishing vessels were still operating normally. There were no distress lights, no emergency radio calls. No visible signs of disruption from that position. Those observations reinforced the initial assumption. If a fishing vessel had suffered a serious accident, a distress signal should have followed. If a major incident had occurred, the surface would not have appeared so calm. Within the system's operating logic, the situation remained acceptable. The next decision followed procedure. After a brief inspection revealed no immediate emergency, the submarine resumed its training exercise. The drills were not yet complete. There was no clear justification to halt the operation. At that moment, no one below the surface knew that Antares had already sunk. No one knew that 4 men had disappeared from the water just minutes earlier. There was no distress signal, no call for help. And therefore, no emergency response was triggered. When no alarm is raised, how many disasters exist without being seen? The following morning. On the surface of the Firth of Clyde. When daylight came, the first signs appeared on the surface. Not radio calls, not alarms, but objects drifting without order or pattern. Fishing vessels in the area began to notice fish boxes, then small pieces of wood. After that, a thin slick of oil spreading across the water. These signs did not appear all at once. They were discovered gradually by people who were still carrying out their routine work. At first, no one immediately connected them to a serious accident. In fishing grounds, floating debris is not uncommon. But as more fragments surfaced, and the oil slick extended along a consistent line, the initial assumptions began to fail. Information was passed along. Reports were sent ashore. A suspicion formed. A fishing vessel may have been lost during the night. By this point, the gap between the event and its recognition had already stretched into hours. An official alert was raised. Search units were deployed. Helicopters flew low over the water. From the air, the pattern became unmistakable. What the sea had held in silence was now impossible to ignore. But by then, every opportunity for rescue had already passed. What remained was only confirmation that a disaster had occurred, and that it had been over long before anyone realized it. The sea does not speak, but it always leaves traces. Silence on the water does not mean safety. In the days that followed, on the seabed of the Firth of Clyde, the wreck of Antares was located on the seabed at a depth of approximately 150 meters. The vessel lay on her starboard side, consistent with the last known movement before she disappeared. The position of the wreck aligned with the debris field observed on the surface. Upon examination, investigators found the hull largely intact. There were no signs of catastrophic structural failure or direct collision damage. This ruled out the possibility of a conventional impact. What occurred was not a crushing blow, but a pulling force that exceeded the vessel's structural limits. Inside the wreck, there was no evidence that the crew had an opportunity to organize an escape. No life-saving equipment had been deployed. The sequence of events indicated that flooding occurred extremely rapidly, leaving only seconds to respond. Investigation focused on the chain of decisions leading up to the incident. On board the submarine, Watchkeeping procedures and situational assessment were reviewed step by step. Data showed that a sonar contact had been interpreted as a single vessel, when in reality it was the overlap of two civilian vessels operating in close proximity. No equipment failure was identified. No procedure was found to have been deliberately violated. Each decision conformed to existing guidance based on the information available at the time and the way the system was designed to operate. The official conclusion did not assign blame to a single action. Suffering. The disaster did not originate from one major mistake, but from a sequence of small deviations, each reasonable in isolation, that combined to produce an irreversible outcome. The accident was created by reasonable decisions. And when every decision is correct within its own framework, there is no place for a clear warning to appear. After the investigation, changes implemented. Once the cause of the accident was established, the system began to respond. Not on the surface that night, but in meeting rooms, formal reports, and revised operating procedures. The required separation distance between submarines and fishing vessels was increased. The previous standard was no longer considered sufficient. A wider buffer zone was introduced to provide additional reaction time in situations where sonar cannot deliver a complete picture. Training procedures were also revised. Exercises were no longer conducted in total isolation. Civilian maritime activity was formally incorporated into situational awareness requirements. Contact assessment could no longer rely solely on military logic, but had to account for overlapping non-military sound sources. During subsequent training operations, surface vessels were required to be present. Their role was not to participate in the exercise itself, but to monitor the surrounding environment, adding an independent layer of observation beyond what submerged sonar could provide. A gap that had existed between two worlds was filled by human oversight and intermediary assets. These changes were not driven by theory. They were driven by the fact that one vessel now rested on the seabed and 4 men did not return home. The system adjusted only after the outcome had become irreversible. None of these measures were considered radical. All would have been reasonable if applied earlier. But within large organizations, safety margins are often expanded only after they have already been breached. Regulations always follow disaster. The legacy of Antares. When everything is over, the sea returns to its original state. No unusual movement, no signals, no sound that hints at what happened during the night. Antares did not sink because of a storm, not because of a catastrophic technical failure. She disappeared in the gap between systems that were all believed to be sufficient. The wreck of Antares was displayed for years, standing as a silent record. A memorial plaque now rests along the shoreline, bearing the names of the 4 men who never returned. Training procedures were rewritten, safety distances were expanded. The presence of surface vessels became mandatory. Those changes remain, even though the vessel does not. Harbors are still busy. Nets are still cast. Boats still leave port every night, and the sea remains calm. As increasingly complex systems operate side by side in the same space, who is responsible for what no system was designed to see? If you'd like to continue, explore more stories of disasters that occurred when everything appeared to be normal.